Okay, go ahead.
Righty, excellent. Welcome everybody. Nice to see everybody. We're ready to dive into further discussions about biomass. I'll run through the agenda quickly. I want to share some ground rules that I think Judy shared with me that I think will work really nicely for this group, and then we'll dive in. So in a second, we want to do an introduction of two new members, which Jane will explain in just a second, and looking forward to that. And we'll do that. Then I want to talk a little bit about kind of an invitation or ground rules for how we can interact with each other to make sure that we're as productive, constructive, and thoughtful to each other as possible. And then the primary purpose of today is just level set among the sort of subcommittees and the work, really the work that has, I'm not saying the work done to date is determinative or the end of all. It's just we want to know kind of what's been done to date. So we want to talk about the inventory, particularly in relation to biomass. And I think that we have Colin here to share with that. And then we want to talk a little bit more about the clean heat standard and its relation to biomass too. So we're clear, and I think that's actually in the legislature now, but we want to talk about that. And then we also do want to begin to review tabled actions. Judy, you sent some slides to me and Jane this morning. Do you want to cover those at the end of the day today or cover those next meeting? And Judy, you're on mute.
You don't need to cover them. The part of the reason I sent them is because of the definitions listed there.
Okay.
And so if we have to come up with definitions, those definitions are what McNeil uses.
Okay. And Judy, do you want us, can we distribute those slides to other people after today? What do you want us to do with those? I want to be respectful.
Sure, you can. You
Right.
can.
Okay.
It's just that when I looked on the on the form, our definition of biomass is, it sounds reasonable and logical, but when you look at the definition McNeil has posted on their gate, it's totally different,
Okay.
as is all the other definitions they use. And so that's why I just wanted to make sure we were on the same page.
Okay, and that when we get to definition, that'll be a really important conversation to have. That's very helpful. Thanks, Judy. Thanks for doing that work. Okay, and again, about 12:50, we'll have public comment, and we'll have to end right at that. Okay, so first, Jane, do you want to introduce our new folks?
Yeah, morning, everyone. At a previous meeting of this group, we decided as we moved forward in the space that we would have 3 representations from cross-sector subcommittee and 3 from Ag and Ecosystems, and had the hope of also pulling someone in from the Science and Data subcommittee to coordinate the work in that space as well. So Megan O'Toole is joining us. She works within the DEC in the Air Quality and Climate Division, and is the co-chair with TJ Poor. Well, sorry, took TJ Poor's spot as co-chair with Jared Duval on the Science and Data subcommittee. So Megan's joining us in her role in that space. Colin Smythe is also here today. I'm just going to mention and give a shout out to Colin, who's gracious enough to join us and talk about the greenhouse gas inventory. And he's going, my understanding and expectation is that he's interested in joining also as state staff support in the on this going forward in some capacity. So even after today, hopefully Colin will be here as a resource for us to tap into, but isn't actually sitting on any of the subcommittees, is really here to provide an overview and expectation around ongoing work with the greenhouse gas inventory to look at biomass. And then Commissioner Walk is joining us now on behalf of Rich. So Rich Cowart, based on all the conversations around scale and scope of this group, felt like he did not have the time commitment to give to this resource adequately, as well as he's been tasked to do some pretty comprehensive work in Massachusetts around their development of a clean heat standard there. So Peter, with all of his free time as commissioner, has graciously agreed that he would step in and serve on behalf of Rich as the 3rd representative from cross-sector, and is the other co-chair for cross-sector, so it's great to have him here today. And he'll actually also speak to the clean heat standard today. So apologize for the changes, but just as we start going, making sure that people have adequate time to commit to this work, which is great.
Great. All right. Thank you. Good. Any Peter, welcome. Megan, welcome. And probably everybody knows everybody, but just maybe real quick, why don't we just do a round of introductions for everybody? So why don't you just say your name and affiliation? So Liz, why don't you go first?
Hi, everybody. I'm Liz Miller. I'm on the Climate Council as the House's appointee in the utility seat, and I'm on cross sector.
And you work for?
And I work for Green Mountain Power.
Perfect, thank you. Billy.
Good morning, I'm Billy Coster. I'm the co-chair along with Abby Course of the Agriculture Ecosystem Subcommittee of the Climate Council, and I work at the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources.
Great, thanks. Judy.
My name is Judy Dow. I'm from Gidakana and also a representative of the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee.
Thanks, Charlie.
Morning, Charlie Hancock, representative from the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, and I'm a consulting forester based up here in Montgomery, Vermont.
Megan, we'll let you introduce yourself as well, so go for it.
Hi everyone, Megan O'Toole, as Jane said, I'm a climate change mitigation coordinator in the air division at DEC, and I'm happy to be joining this group and look forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks, Megan. Peter.
Patrick, did you say me? I couldn't quite hear
I
you.
did, sorry, yeah, Peter.
I'm sorry. I'm Peter Walk. I'm the commissioner of the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation and co-chair of the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee. I'm excited to be here with you all today. I appreciate you bringing me up to speed. I'm sorry to be jumping in midstream, but Rich wasn't able to invest the time and want to make sure that we had appropriate representation on the group. So thanks.
Welcome, Peter. Terrific. Okay, so I want to just share a few kind of invitations or ground rules to the group and see if the group feels okay with adopting them or modifying them as needed. So let me just kind of, let me actually project these and then we'll just look at them real quick. They were in the agenda, but I want to be explicit about it. So, did that come up okay? As you all know, this can be a challenging and complicated and sometimes contentious conversation. So we want to make sure among the small working group, we are constructive and kind of respectful of each other as we can be. So I kind of put forward, or really with Judy's help from other work she's done, put forward these kind of 5 or so sort of ground rules or invitations. And I want to see how people feel about them, which is want everybody to be present with a clear mind and an open heart. Really important to listen generously across differences, recognizing that we don't share the same views, but to really listen and not just start making your counter argument before the person is actually done speaking. And with recognizing the boundary of self-care, is some of the stuff can be provocative and want people to take care of themselves. People need to be explicit about what they need, so we can really talk about what your needs are, what your concerns are, and we want to do that in the spirit of both transparency and being forthright, and then also being respectful of other people as they put those forward. You may not like it or may not agree with those needs, but they are what they are. So then we need to tend to them in some way. And we want people to speak their viewpoint, their perspective, and feel safe and comfortable and free to do that, while also being thoughtful about how they speak about what they're thinking about or concerned about or their views. So we're respectful of others in the room who may come from a varied and different range of experiences and backgrounds. And I think this last one is so applicable to this issue, which is this is a really complicated topic. I think in terms of economically, scientifically, I think personally in some ways. And so there's just a gob of complexity to sort through here. And I think if we can all be respectful that we're all collectively trying to sort through the miasma here and do that as fellow journeyers, I think that would be very, very helpful. So I want to see if anybody has any further questions about these, concerns about these, or other things we ought to mention as kind of group norms as we go forward. Okay, so what I want to do, so I want to be a little explicit about this. I just want to go to the group and just say, just get a yay, I'm good with these. So Liz, are you good with those? Thumbs up or verbal? Great. Billy?
Yeah, thanks for sharing those, Julie, or Judy.
Judy? Great. Charlie?
Yep, and thanks, Judy, for putting them together.
Megan? Great. Peter? Great. And we'll ask DJ when we see him soon too. So, okay, terrific. Okay, appreciate that, Judy. Thanks again. I think those are very, very helpful. One, this is a side note. The chat I have found through all the process can be very helpful, but with a few boundaries around it. I would ask members of the public certainly can feel free to use it if they want to clarify a point as we're talking, because we know your comment period is very limited. You have a data source you want to share, all that's good. I would ask you to be a little bit judicious because it can be distracting for people when we're trying to have a conversation. And so multitasking, some people are better than others, and none of us are great at it. So just be judicious. And I would ask that the working group not get into back and forth in the chat. It's not a place really to handle disagreements. I don't think it works very well. So I think if stuff is in there you disagree with, I think note it. We can talk about it. The chat is just kind of the commentary to the side. I don't want it to kind of distract us from the conversation we all or you all need to be having with each other. Okay. So just a few ground rules around the chat. Okay. With that, I think, again, what in constructing this next agenda, Jane and I thought, and from our last conversation, it'd be really important to most kind of level set among everybody, kind of where we're at with certain things. Doesn't mean it's where we should be, but it's kind of where we're at. So this is really the purpose of these next two things is just for understanding. And then with that basis, we're going to go back through the tabled actions. I think Charlie and Judy, who worked really hard on these, are probably going to need to also do some level setting and sharing of what they are and how we got there. And then we'll start trying to work through those one by one in terms of whether we need, hey, these are kind of tended to or what we need to kind of dive into them. So, but with that, let's start with some kind of joint learning. And I think I'm going to turn this over to Colin, who's going to talk about the inventory generally, and then very specifically, obviously, in relation to biomass. So Colin, I'll hand this over to you.
Great, thanks, Pat. And I just have 2 slides that I would love to put up if I may. Let's see. Is that working for you all?
Yes.
Great. All right, so yes, I'm Colin Smythe from Vermont DEC Air Quality and Climate Division, and I do the greenhouse gas inventory for the state. And I am just going to give kind of a very brief overview of how the inventory kind of accounts for biomass currently, and kind of some of the ongoing processes for which we're trying to improve that kind of understanding. But like as Pat said, it's a complicated issue and complicated data sets as well. So kind of the bottom line is in the actual kind of officially tracked inventory totals, biogenic carbon dioxide is zeroed out. And it's tracked as a separate component in the inventory, but it's kind of not included in those official totals. And that is kind of on par with IPCC and EPA guidelines, and it's consistent currently with other states in the region and how they do their greenhouse gas inventories. So kind of the theory behind that is essentially, as probably all of you know, but that when that biomass, when the CO2 is emitted from that biomass, it is in theory resequestered by the regrowth of plants, and kind of that's the rationale. And there's a lot of nuance and discussion that can go into that, but that's kind of why that assumption is made kind of at a higher level. And the other component of that is that it is also supposed to be captured in the land use changes kind of section of the inventory. That's a little bit problematic and has been problematic just because of kind of the granularity of available data in that space and being able to accurately kind of see the fluxes year to year. And there's, as I'll kind of get to on the next slide a little bit, there's a lot of work being done in that space right now to try and improve those estimates. But to my knowledge, it's not there yet. And so it's kind of an ongoing process, but accuracy of the land use data and the historical estimates especially have kind of been unreliable, but are being worked on. And this does kind of, it creates a disconnect in if you're not accounting kind of in your gross tracking for any emissions of CO2 from biomass combustion, but you're also not including the land use sector in your official estimates. And like I said, we track them separately, but they're not in our actual official totals. It kind of creates a disconnect there. And I think that's going to be a big kind of, that's a big area of investigation, but it's also something that I think this group is probably going to have to better understand and kind of, yeah, grapple with, I guess. So I just kind of have at the bottom kind of an illustration of what kind of the estimates of carbon sequestration related to forests is. And then if you were to include, and this is kind of it's a little bit more granular of a similar graph that I have in the last iteration of the inventory. But this breaks out kind of the emissions, and I'm focusing this mainly on, this graph is all on wood combustion. I think that's kind of another discussion on what we mean by biomass, because biofuels, kind of like ethanol, biodiesel, have their own suite of details and considerations to get into. But this is just from wood combustion. And this is from the residential, commercial, industrial, and electricity generation sectors. And so these are the emissions associated if you were to include the CO2 emitted in those processes, which is not included right now, or is tracked separately, I guess. So that probably a little long-winded there, but felt that it was important to have a little bit of the detail in there. Let me go on to the next slide here, if I can make that happen. Sorry, hold on. There we go. Sorry, Judy, did you have a question you wanted to ask now, or you?
I do. Could you please not use acronyms? Could you say out what you're talking about?
Sure, I'm sorry.
I don't know what all the letters are.
I'm sorry about that. I use so many acronyms, I get very caught up in that.
Thank you.
Is there a particular one that I didn't say?
No, I'll follow. I'll try my best. I'm trying my best to follow.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, definitely jump in and stop me if I do that, because I live in a world of acronyms. So kind of, I mentioned that there's a lot of ongoing work in this space, and these are just a couple of the initiatives that that we are kind of currently taking part in or are going to be taking part in. The first one of these is the Northeast Net Zero Carbon Collaborative, and it's a partnership from a few states. You can see Vermont, Maine, and Massachusetts in kind of, I think it's kind of facilitated through the U.S. Climate Alliance, although I'm not positive about that. And Ali Kasiba is the one who is really involved in that. But it's to kind of help make a more robust accounting framework that kind of figures out some of these nuanced issues, especially related to forestry, but also in, and I guess a little bit of the broader land use sector, to help inform greenhouse gas mitigation plans and policies. The second piece is that there's also a separate kind of U.S. Climate Alliance working group, the Natural Working Lands Working Group, and the Emissions Working Group, who are also have been and are going to continue looking into these issues and trying to figure out and kind of hash out better ways to quantify this going forward. There is also, the EPA puts out a state inventory tool, which it's a tool that we use, or the SIT tool is the abbreviation that you hear a lot for that one. And that is kind of, it's a set of modules kind of for all the different sectors in the inventory. We use some of them, we don't use others, depending on the sector, but EPA has just come out with some modifications, and we've been in a discussion with the Ag Agency on potentially either changing the use of that tool or potentially modifying that tool in some way to incorporate their concerns in the ag sector. They also have a land use change module that we're going to be investigating and probably work with Ali to see what the best way to come up with those estimates would be. And then, as has been mentioned in the Global Warming Solutions Act process, I know Richard Hopkins especially was very interested in this, but was running different sensitivities on kind of biomass combustion. And kind of if you don't count it as kind of a full, say, GWP1 carbon dioxide emission, if you were to partially count it, what would the implications be? And so running some sensitivities to kind of get a range, but some work is going to have to be done to kind of figure out what value would be appropriate to assign to that. And I think that's going to probably depend a lot on that wood fuel source and probably how and where it's combusted. But there's a lot more thinking to be done on that as well.
Colin, GWP stands for?
I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. Global warming potential. That's how potent the warming ability of a gas is in relation to carbon dioxide. So some gases like methane and nitrous oxide are much more kind of potent warmers than carbon dioxide is. And so assigning a partial kind of, if it were just carbon dioxide fully we were counting, we would assign it a value of 1. But the idea would be to say maybe it's 0.5 or something like that. And that would reduce the emissions that would be kind of included. But so a lot more thinking needs to be done on that. And I need to honestly do a little bit of research into the GWP, global warming potential bio idea that Richard Hopkins put out there. So other land use accounting work is kind of ongoing as well, or hopefully soon to be ongoing. And that is kind of a deeper investigation into the agricultural sector tools, and hopefully going to have a contractor doing that soon to kind of figure out if there's a better tool to help more accurately quantify kind of both emissions from and kind of incorporating management practices from the ag sector into that space, into a tool, and hopefully coming up with a more robust and kind of an estimate of net kind of change within that space as well. And yeah, I guess also kind of all the things above, incorporating all the outcomes of those investigations into the greenhouse gas inventory as it's appropriate and as we have confidence in those kind of tools and data sets. But yes, I've said it a lot of times already, but I feel like, and Pat said it as well, there's a lot of complexity and nuance in this. So it's going to take a lot of digging and a lot of understanding to try to get it as close to right as we can. So that's about all I have for a presentation, but happy to talk, answer questions if I can, or yeah, be helpful in whatever way I can.
Right. Why don't we just see it so we can see people's faces, and we always come back to that chart or graph if people need.
Yes, let me figure out how to get out. Stop sharing here.
No problem. So I would say working group here, jump right in, questions.
There we go.
For clarity, again, what's currently is the case and what's going forward. Judy, go for it.
The partnership you talked about throughout New England and the greenhouse gas emissions, where do we stand within that partnership?
I'm sorry, in terms of what do you mean exactly by where do we stand in the?
Are we the leader of the pack? Are we the end of the pack? Are we the middle of the pack?
You know, I don't know. I haven't heard updates recently on a lot of other states. The last I've heard, my guess would be that we were middle of the pack. I think everybody is looking at this, but everybody also has a lot of other things going on simultaneously. And so, yeah, I haven't heard of any kind of major progress at this point, but I think everybody in their inventory process is considering how to deal with these issues. But I think the problem is that nobody has a perfect solution or even a great solution yet. So I think there will be a lot of work and coordination to be done regionally still.
Thank you.
Thanks. Other questions about the inventory? Charlie, over to you.
Thanks. I just wanted to just kind of clarifying at a high level, because I haven't had a chance to follow all of the Climate Council's full meetings or the steering committee meetings, but I was under the impression that it was still a little bit of kind of not settled upon as far as the greenhouse gas accounting or the inventory goes for working lands, forestry, ag, whether they would be net versus gross. And this sounds like it's a sealed deal that the GHG inventory is going to consider working lands in that context as being net emissions. Is that not the case? Okay. I'm just I like trying to make sure like what we're hearing is on the same page with everybody and understand that correctly. So if someone could help give some context there, that'd be great.
I will do my best, or Jane, feel free to jump in if you'd like, but I guess I will say that it is our intention to try to come up with a net value for the natural working lands and incorporating ag. But I do not think that we are planning on making that the official tracking value estimate. So I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, but I think the idea right now, certainly until we have way more confidence in that number, and I think it probably gets into statute as well, but would be to kind of have a companion kind of an estimate. And that's kind of what a lot of other states and how it's recommended you kind of track it anyway. But I think, I don't know if that helps, but kind of a separate component that does estimate that, but is not the official like tracking metric.
But I might just add, and hope others will too if I misspeak too, but as far as the council goes, you know, the work that we've done to date was to first look at our greenhouse gas inventory and review it against neighboring states as well as California, and sort of critically look at, were we in line with how we tracked our emissions, and are we doing it consistently with other states? And for the sake of this first climate action plan, the work that we did said, yes, we're consistent with other states in the way that we value and track our inventory. We also acknowledged through the work of the carbon budget that there was more that we could learn and understand with respect to the natural and working land sector. And we're open and really interested in further understanding. I think that the way other states do it is consistent with what Colin is speaking to, which is a supplemental tool that points to and makes decisions about net emissions outside of the inventory. I don't think that we've decided definitively one way or another, but that would be in line with other states. And we have 2 separate Climate Alliance grants out right now. One specific on the recommendations that Ag and Eco put forward in this space, really focused in on ag emissions, but then also a regional grant that Ali Kasiba helped lead on with other states looking at the forest sector broadly, and then other natural and working land sectors to a lesser extent. And so it's a commitment that we are open to learning better to how to do this, and learning from other states, and then also learning through scientific research and understanding about the best way to do this either within the inventory or more likely outside of the inventory as a supplemental analysis. But I wouldn't say it's totally closed yet, but I could be wrong in that space.
Well, I mean, I guess whether we label it supplemental or part of it, or like a distant cousin or whatever, cars don't sequester carbon, forests sequester carbon, right? So it's a different animal, right? And I think, especially as far as this conversation goes, but also the rest of the working lands conversations in this space go, until we can have kind of that real solid net impact around the life cycle accounting questions, we're kind of just having a conversation for the sake of a conversation, right? We can't actually make recommendations about what things to tweak, dials to push, levers to pull about more or less of something until we understand the impacts of it. So I guess I'm just a long-winded way of saying, I think we need to have a better understanding of the net impacts of what we're talking about before we can say, yes, more biomass moving away from fossil fuels will create a net impact of Y as opposed to something else. Otherwise, it's kind of just, a bunch of words until we can put numbers to them.
And Charlie, I'm assuming for the purposes, I realize the broader inventory has a lot of science and hard work behind it and lots of different strands that are working on it. But I do think the purpose of this conversation is in some ways to get at that question, to try to parse the net question. And that's really part of our task.
Exactly. And so I guess what I'm getting at is like, if it's not gonna happen, or it's not being pushed for, or there isn't the support for that, I would offer that a recommendation right off the bat from this group would be do it, because we can't have answers to the questions we got until we have that information. And if it is being done, then part of me does wonder a little bit, you know, how accurate kind of recommendations around adjusting biomass in the big picture, more or less, until we have those numbers to adjust against, right? Because until we know the impact of actions we're recommending against the current situation, we really can't tell what the impacts are going to be, other than just kind of theoretical. We know that this might be raising or lowering something.
And Colin, do you want to go back to that slide with the work going forward? And then I have a question for the first slide, but and then Judy, I'll go to you in a second. I just want to follow up on Charlie for 1 second, then I'll go to Judy. So in terms of the work you're doing to expand your understanding of biomass for the inventory that Vermont currently does, you have both, I guess, the kind of trying to account for natural working lands generally that at the Climate States Alliance is working on. Then there was, I think separately was the specific ag request that I think is distinct from this. And then was there another specific biomass piece that was happening, Colin? Was just to be clear. And don't worry about the slide. You can just talk to it. It's fine. And you're on mute, by the way.
Sorry about that. I was trying to pull the slide up.
That's okay.
Sorry, you said.
Yeah, I just want to be clear about the work you are doing going forward to this question of you know, trying to get at, I mean, whether we include in the inventory or not, maybe it's a legislative question, I don't know, but in terms of actually trying to understand the net accounting of biomass, just the work that's going forward to try to do that. So just one more
Sure.
time.
And that, I think the Northeast Zero or Net Zero Carbon Collaborative that Ali is a part of is going to focus more specifically on forests in that space. The kind of natural working lands group of the Climate Alliance will certainly be discussing that, but is more, say, holistic in the land use kind of space than that. And I have been somewhat involved. I know there have been others from the state, Ali and Ryan Patch, I think, who have also been involved in that group. I don't know specifically what they will be working on, but it's definitely kind of one of their priorities for the next year that has been flagged to discuss and look at. And then Jane kind of mentioned the RFP, I think, for the ag space, looking at the tools. I think that was the one you were talking about, Jane. So yes, there are at least kind of three distinct pieces there going forward. And I expect, usually as the case in these kind of state groups anyway, there will be overlap between the people from the states on those two. So it should be a pretty good effort, I think, especially because everybody is wondering about this, all the data and the tools and the estimates in this sector.
Okay. Judy, over to you.
Thank you, Colin, for your presentation, and Jane and Charlie for your clarification.
Sure.
For those who were not on the Ag and Ecosystems Committee, Ali was there and she was a part of our discussions. And as Isaac mentioned in the chat, one of the things that we had huge concerns over is that a clear-cut forest, if not rebuilt on, is still counted as a forest in the formula for calculating carbon storage. And do you know if that's being addressed by Ali? It was brought up many, many times that yes, many people use this formula, but yes, it's the only formula available. And so we talked about making our own formula. And because it takes so long for an 80-year-old tree that's cut down to restore what it did before, it shouldn't be counted in the formula as the same as a forest that has 80-year-old trees. And it is. And so I wondered if that's being considered. And also the other issue that we often brought up is putting these industrial agricultural programs like forestry, putting economy first instead of the land itself? And will that be addressed in this formula that Ally's working on for the year? And I'm also interested in knowing what your definition of biomass is.
And Judy, maybe take this one at a time. So first, I think on the question of, because if I remember right, Judy and Charlie in our working group, what we discussed, Billy, was, I don't know whether it was because of the way you accounted for forest was due to current use. So if it was in current use as forest, it was forest. But there was some reason why the quality of the land in terms of forest wasn't necessarily captured, I think, but I can't remember the details. And Colin, can you speak to that one first?
Sorry, the quality of the land wasn't captured?
Well, the quality of the forest, so to speak. So in other words, if for some reason I think Ally did note, and Billy, maybe you can clarify that there is some land that would be accounted for as forest, which is actually not necessarily currently in forest because it was cut extensively or to some degree. Charlie, can you or Billy speak to that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I don't think they are, nor is it possible to take into account a 2-acre patch cut or a 50-acre clear cut, you know, some like right around here in the overall accounting of it. But what I think they were trying to do is use FIA data, which is forest inventory analysis, to basically get an idea of what percentage of the landscape is in what is in what forest type. And so that we had an idea of kind of average fluxes as it accounts for that. That was my understanding, just because the granularity of something happening on one acre or another, we will never be able to know. But if we've got the data through either FIA or Forest and Parks, other kind of data, then we can use it to establish kind of average norms as they occur on the landscape right now. That was my understanding of how they were measuring that.
And Liz,
but to that point, I do think that they were calling an area that has been harvested is still a forest. And so, I mean, we can get into specifics, but like a 2-acre patch cut, if there's no trees left in it, is still part of a larger forest matrix. And so those areas would still be considered in the accounting of forest overall. It's not until the forest is converted to non-forest use through some sort of other kind of development that it comes off of the equation as far as the land base we're looking at.
Liz, do you have a question specific to this or a different one?
No, please continue with Judy.
Okay, Colin, any follow-up to that one for now?
Yes, I will say I have not been involved in Ally's kind of group discussions, and I don't have the depth of expertise that she does. That I do know that they are, or the estimates that I have used in the past are based on FIA data. But that's an interesting point, that something that is clear cut is still considered a forest. I didn't honestly realize that. But yeah, I think you kind of alluded to it, Charlie. It's like the issue here is trying to find a data set that encompasses the entire state and is granular enough to pick up the changes that we want to account for. And I think that's what I think all of the other states are struggling with as well. And it's just not an easy, like, to my knowledge, a product doesn't really exist that does that well. And I'm sure there are lots of different kind of remote sensing products that people are going to be trying to come up with and use to do that, but I'm not sure if they're there yet, and maybe others can speak more to that. But I think that's the problem. And I don't know, like, to get your question specifically, Judy, I don't know if there is, I would assume that they would like to incorporate that kind of information. I don't know if that's data that they can get. Like if we had a good idea of how many kind of patch clear cut acres there were in the state, we could incorporate that. And maybe that is data that we have. If it is, then it would be great to kind of be able to kind of compile all that data somewhere. Because like, that's kind of my problem too. And that's why it would be great to have Ally's input on this. And it sounds like you all have, but just what is available, she would know better than I in terms of data products to kind of incorporate into this calculation. But I will say that the calculation, the inventory, certainly going forward, she wasn't around for the last creation of the last inventory, but I definitely plan to work with her to kind of And I think she probably uses a lot of the same products, data products that I do, emissions flux estimates that I do. So we're definitely planning to incorporate it and make it as accurate as we can. But yeah, I think the data is the real kind of tough
Right.
question there.
One of the things we discovered in our discussions was the lack of communication with the Green Mountain Forest and their attempts to clear cut like 40,000 acres or some outrageous number like that. And so we can plan all we want and they go ahead and do what they want. And there's little to no conversation between the state and the feds, then we're losing a lot more than we're gaining. And so there's not an accurate net zero count.
I'm going to go to this next question, which is around the economy, and if you can answer that one, and then I'll go to the definition last.
Sure. I guess I just had a kind of clarifying question on that, Judy. When you say kind of put the economy first, I believe that was what you said, and will that be addressed? What exactly do you mean by putting the economy first?
Well, we're in a crisis, right? And if we don't put the land or the crisis first and economy second, we're never going to solve the problem. And a lot of what you said put economy first.
I guess my response to that would be that in the inventory, we're not really trying to put anything, or the inventory is not supposed to be, the intention is not to kind of put anything first, prioritize anything. We're really just trying to work as best we can to get as accurate an emissions picture as we can. It's not meant to be something that drives policy. It's meant to be, here are the emissions associated with these activities. And I totally understand that it's hard to disconnect that, but just so you know, that's what it's meant to be, is just a picture of emissions. It's not, there's no agenda associated with it. And I understand that some of the decisions that have to be made just to come up with a number make it appear sometimes that there might be an agenda, but it's really just us using our best judgment to try to come up with an emission that makes the most sense in terms of kind of a scientific justification basis.
Right. And economy is exactly why I'm looking at these two acre or 50 acre clear cuts as putting economy over land and over the crisis. If the crisis is continuing to store more carbon, how can we keep clear cutting?
Colin, next question, then I'll go to some other questions. Just on
can I just quickly jump in there? Judy, I think that's a great question, and it's a great policy question, right? What do we want to do in response to this crisis? How are we going to act? I want to make sure that in doing that, we keep separate the how do we measure the impact of our actions, which is what we're talking about with the inventory. I want to make sure that we discuss those things that you mentioned relative to the economy, but that we keep the inventory as the apolitical accounting measurement for the work involved. So that I would like to create that separation.
That would work, Peter, if it wasn't true that when you pull on nature, you find everything is connected.
And I agree with that. I'm saying we would address that through things that we would overlay, that we would decide as a society were of sufficient value to change the way humans are acting currently, to make adjustments. That's all I'm asking us to do, that, not by the way in which we measure the impact of those actions overall.
Well, they're still connected.
Of course they're connected, but we shouldn't be trying to create change through the measurement process, is all I'm saying.
Well, the measurement process is broke. That's what we've been trying to say here.
And I think let me just note the concern for now, and I want to move on because of time, but I do think that, again, if we can do inaccurate accounting, including small patches of forest, which could add up over time, to Charlie's point, if we don't understand the overall net, it's hard to kind of come up with a recommendation. I think that's what we're struggling with. So I think understand the complexity of this and the inventory. It sounds like we were working towards it. We may need Ally back in here at some point to kind of further have this conversation as we think about how the accounting works. But on definition, Colin, if you actually have if there's actually a written definition of biomass for the inventory, if you just put it in chat, and that would be very helpful just to have the definition you use, or it's in the inventory or wherever it sits in terms of just in writing. To Judy's last question.
Yes, I will look for that. I don't think I have an actual definition of biomass in the inventory, but we assume it is the same as EPA's definition. So I'll look for that kind of in their report and drop it in there.
That'd be great. Thank you. Liz, over to you, and then back to Judy.
Thank you. Hopefully not well past to make this point now. I just wanted to pick up on something Charlie said some time ago and speak in support of it. Charlie, I think you were talking about, given what we saw in Colin's presentation and some of the learning that we're doing today and looks like we'll be doing in coming meetings, just putting it somewhere on our list with a pin to come back and talk about whether now is the right time to be making these recommendations, revisiting some of the work that was done. It was brought up at the Climate Council meeting. I believe both Abby and Joey, Abby Corse and Joey Miller brought it up, and I spoke in favor of it at the time, just thinking about whether, in light of everything that's going on and being studied and more that needs to be learned, whether we're tackling this at the right time. So I just want to pick up on that point I think Charlie was making and offer some support to discussing it further at the right time.
And Liz, one thing I was thinking is as we're going to get to the heat standard next, just to make sure we cover that, and we'll start diving into the tabled actions. And then I think as we do that, we can debate whether we feel we actually can do this now, or we need more learning, or we have to wait. And so I think let's keep that question in mind that both Charlie and Liz raised as we start going to the tabled actions in a little bit, and probably less today, but more starting next time. Judy.
We have to remember time is a gift. Time is a luxury. We don't have time. We're in a crisis. We have to learn what we can as fast as we can and get a solution.
Yeah, I would agree with Judy. I completely agree that we are on borrowed time here. My main point is that as we make recommendations, I think some of those recommendations might be measure this, get us this answer, right? Like, so it might not be pull this switch, push this button, but before we can do that, we need that answer, and we need it now, to Judy's point, right? So that's it.
Right. Okay. Let's go to the heat standard next. So thank you, Colin, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Very, very helpful. And I'm sure we'll come back to that first graph you showed at some point to ask further questions, but we'll do that later. So thanks so much. Really, very helpful. Okay. Clean heat standard. And I can't remember, Jane, who was going to cover this.
That's going to be me.
Okay, great, Peter, great. So Peter's going to describe the clean heat standard. I think the council recommendations, I think there's something in front of the legislature right now. So Peter, I'll turn it over to you to walk us through.
I just wanted to provide an update to where the bill is evolved and how it treats biomass currently in the bill that is going to the House floor tomorrow. So the bill as it currently stands is H715. And I can drop a link in the chat here shortly with the language in there. Proposes to evaluate all clean heat measures by life cycle accounting analysis. So it would look at all potential measures that could be used to generate clean heat credits to comply with the system in order to, by looking at their life cycle analysis. And it mentions the GREET model as a potential option to use that, or a similar sort of piece. The language that is further in the legislation that speaks to sort of how it still has to relate back to the inventory. And this is to Charlie, some of your points about how do we make rational decisions when we don't have apples to apples comparisons. And I would agree with you that if there is data information that we need, or we think we need, or that we need to figure out how to get if it doesn't exist, that's a really good conversation to have, because it does feel like we sort of spin around without the ability to answer certain basic questions. That is sort of a factor in that. So we're going to essentially take, from time to time, true up the number of clean heat measures towards what the impact is on the emissions under the inventory, knowing that the emissions inventory does not speak to life cycle emissions analysis. And so it'll be a bit of a complicated step, but it was a priority for many stakeholders in the committee of jurisdiction, the House Energy and Technology Committee, to look at life cycle emissions and understand what the impact of different policy choices were. And those would implicate all clean heat measures. So we would understand, everything from biomass to biofuels to the carbon intensity of say cold climate heat pumps and the like. And so trying to understand exactly what, well, as close as possible to understand what the true impact of all those decisions are. And so there's certainly a desire to understand those pieces. It's going to be an imperfect process, because there's going to be a certain set of expectations and assumptions built into how we evaluate each one. That's going to be sort of on the average, this is what a cold climate heat pump does, or this is the impact of biomass. And there's no way to be able to do a sort of site specific evaluation for each one. So I want to just, sort of add that piece as a clarification. Judy, you have a question?
I do have a question. I listened to many hours of tape of you speaking, and I don't agree with your definition of clean energy. And I'm not sure there's equity in what you're talking about either. And is other opinions going to be considered in this bill, or is it just your definition of what clean energy is and no equity is going to be considered?
I guess I would seek to understand what you
Well, we had this discussion, you and I, before about cars, these electric cars, and you referred to them as clean. And I said, but there's no equity in them, and there's no way to recycle the batteries. The batteries doesn't have a life cycle, right? And so the lack of equity is because the electricity to charge them will come from Hydro-Quebec. And Hydro-Quebec is already taken 11 native villages, and they're looking to take 5 more. There's no equity in that. There's no global equity in that at all. And because the indigenous people hold 80% of the biodiversity, and they're covering it with water. So was that perspective presented, or are they going by your definition of clean energy while they work on this bill? And are they considering equity while they work on this bill?
So Peter, can you explain, like, who's defining clean heat in the clean heat bill in terms of the legislature and whatever agencies, consult with or confer with you?
So the legislature has defined what constitutes a clean heat measure. I have not had any impact on that discussion.
And what is that definition?
It is, I can put it in a chat. It's a non-inclusive list of certain measures that they believe to constitute clean heat measures. It's everything from installation of cold climate heat pumps to weatherization to biomass. It's not saying that there aren't policy trade-offs or implications of those actions, but those are the ones that they have identified as being impactful to our climate work. That's not to say there aren't other considerations. There are certainly Vermont and local equity considerations considered as part of the bill, but the life cycle analysis is going to speak to overall greenhouse gas emissions, not necessarily the impacts of mineral extraction or the filling of reservoirs or other things that happen outside of Vermont's borders. And that's, I accept, Judy, that is a limitation to the approach.
Yeah, it is, because again, everything in nature is connected. And if they eliminate some component of it, it's problematic.
I do want to speak to the thing you said about batteries. We are societally working to identify how to recycle lithium ion batteries and bring them back into reuse, so that we're not simply just creating new issues down the road. So that is something that is actively building societally, and we have those same sorts of programs with other batteries, and we anticipate that will work here as well. And so while that is a concern, it is something that we have a history of being able to work through.
And I just want to make sure we stay on scope. So I know there's all these issues are connected, but if we could stay on sort of woody biomass. And so Peter, I just want to make sure I understand, and maybe the other group understands, just me, who's like, so just give us a quick outline of the clean heat standard the legislators bring forward, just the kind of the key elements that it's generally trying to promote or suggest. I think would be helpful, just make sure we're all level set on what's in it. And obviously you don't have to go through every line, but I think if just a general sense of those elements would be great.
Sure. Let me.
And I put in the link, I think, what is that bill? But if I got the link right, hopefully.
Yeah, let me pull. So the way they've described clean heat measures is defined it as clean heat measure means fuel and technologies delivered and installed to end use customers in Vermont that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Clean heat measures shall not include switching from one fossil fuel to another fossil fuel use to another fossil fuel use. The commission, meaning the Public Utility Commission, may adopt a list of acceptable actions that qualify as clean heat measures. So that is how clean heat measures overall as defined in the bill. And then further, there is a discussion of what the sort of initial list of what they believe constitutes clean heat measures that the commission should continue to evaluate. So they believe it shall include thermal energy efficiency improvements and weatherization, the supply of sustainably sourced biofuels, renewable natural gas and low emission advanced gases, the installation of cold climate heat pumps and efficient electric appliances providing thermal end uses, advanced wood heating appliances and systems, and renewable energy-based district heating services. So those are the specific things. That's not an inclusive list. They anticipate the Public Utility Commission may add additional factors to that, but that is the list that the one committee in the legislature, the House Energy and Technology Committee, has determined to be the list of the initial list of measures that it wants the PUC to evaluate as being clean heat measures.
Okay, that's very helpful. So just so we know what's, again, this is still kind of work in progress because it's in front of the legislature. So, but any questions just on what's in it or not in it at this point? We can certainly in a minute here debate it, but I think just want to make sure we're clear on what's in it. Any questions about that right now? And Peter, just a question for this. And does the clean heat standard address residential as well as kind of commercial and or industrial scale district heating, or is it stay out of the residential question?
Yes, it addresses all of the things that we constitute the residential, commercial, and industrial sector of the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, which is essentially the fuels used for building energy use. That could be that it's primarily thermal, but it could also be for, say, cooking gas and other things. So that all of those pieces that we factor into the inventory in that space is what we're talking about, or what the legislature believes we're talking about.
And they consider that equitable?
You'd have to ask the committee, Judy. I can't speak to that.
Okay.
Great, thanks. Any other questions for Peter on that? Okay, Charlie, go for it.
My hand on me. I'm just curious, if the bill passed, is there any expectation on like a time frame for how long it would take to complete the various life cycle accounting analyses for each individual sector?
So as it stands now, there's a 2-year process to build out the program itself with a significant amount of public input tied into that, and some clearly defined public input that needs to come about as part of the development of the process of the standard as a whole. And so there is, and that's prior to, 2-year period for the PUC to sort of roll out draft implementation and then sort of begin that process. We advocated for significant additional time because it was going to be too fast. And if we learned anything about the Climate Council processes, we need the time to engage. And so the legislature heard that and pushed that timeline out an additional year. So there is a sufficient, maybe not sufficient, there is a considerable amount of time, which again takes time to get that conversation right. We also don't have time. So the pieces that matter here, so I just want to add, so one of the other things that's built into the legislation is the idea that any activity that is deemed to be a clean heat measure that occurs between now and the launch of the program can get credit when the program launches. So we're about to make a significant investment. If the legislature concurs with the governor's recommendation around weatherization in activities that reduce emissions, those will be able to generate credits when the program, assuming the program launches. That will allow us to make significant progress well in advance of the standard actually going into effect. And so that's another piece that exists out there.
Great, Charlie, good follow-up to that. And then just a question, Peter, in terms of the life cycle analysis that would be required, and we know for biomass that can be quite complicated. Is the legislature suggesting they'll put money into budgets to do the life cycle accounting, or how does the resourcing of that happen?
So there is resources specifically tied to both the Public Utility Commission and the Public Service Department to be able to work through that work. There's also a technical advisory group that is formed to help consult with the Public Utility Commission on the work as a whole. So understanding, frankly, I mean, we can talk about biomass being complex. Every single one of these clean heat measures has complexity associated with it. We're specifically talking about biomass right now. The use of energy is inefficient. The use of energy has implications across the board. And so each one of those has different considerations. And so that's what the standard is being asked to consider, is what the implications of those actions are. And trying to figure out how to address them. It's not, I don't think, to my earlier point, I don't think it'll be satisfactory in terms of addressing global equity. But that is a policy consideration that the legislature has not actively said that they don't care, but that is not listed as a priority within the bill.
Great, thank you. All right, any other questions for Peter? Thanks a lot for that, Billy. Any other questions on generally on kind of the current status of the heat standard, clean heat standard? Okay, all right, so what we wanted to do, if we can a bit, is I think we want to just kind of, I think the first thing to do is in terms of the tabled actions, which is going to be our focus. This is very helpful background, and we'll continue to kind of use that in comparison to going through this. I think it might be useful to just make sure we walk through this as a group to know what's in it together for sure. And then we're going to have to come back through each piece and talk about what we want to do with it. So what I'm going to do, Charlie and Judy, I might ask you to help me a bit as we do this. And I want to kind of project this, if that's okay. And we'll kind of walk through this and then make sure we're all on the same page. Again, that's the goal today. And then we're going to have to come back through and take parts and pieces. But so let me project that. So people see that okay? So I think note that there's the topic is framed broadly as it was by the, again, not a consensus, but by the Ag and Subcommittee to forward. This was the broad thing, and then there was a definition offered. So I think Judy's already noted, and has happened in the chat. We're probably gonna have to come back and talk about what we mean by biomass in a definition. We won't necessarily do that today, but I think we've got several ones that we're probably gonna have to wrestle with. But I don't know if Charlie or Judy, you want to say about how we just framed up the overall topic from the Ag and Eco Subcommittee, if it's useful just to mention a little bit of background on how we framed up kind of that bold sentence right there.
You asking the
Yeah.
address the use of biomass for appropriately scaled, et cetera,
Yeah,
et cetera? How that was
exactly.
framed?
Yeah, exactly.
I think the conversation was just around that this is a current, biomass is currently being utilized in the state for various purposes. There's intents to potentially increase the use in certain ways. And I think that the address the use of was getting it basically understand this system better so that we can make better informed recommendations as to changes to it to help meet our carbon reduction goals. Essentially was how I think it was framed. But Judy, feel free to hop on.
Yeah, I think so too, but it was much more expansive than this because we had heard from people that it was growing in schools, they were doing it. People were using the backyard furnaces and there was no teeth for that. They could burn all kinds of trash and are burning all kinds of trash and Pampers and junk mail and stuff like that. And so it was much more expansive than just industrial scale. And it was growing. And so there was concerns, lots of concerns about it. And we heard from the public many times about issues within their community.
And I think the second part of the framing here, while preventing the expansion of biomass for industrial scale, et cetera, I think we talked about how the language there might not have been as clear as it could have been at our last meeting, but I think the intent there was to frame kind of overall that I think the one area of agreement that we came away with was that we were not looking at essentially replicating McNeil or Rygate elsewhere in the state. We can talk about specifics around those individual facilities, but I think the one high level agreement was that as we consider biomass in the future for it in the state or the not future for it, one area that we were going to kind of take off the table was essentially replicating facilities like that elsewhere in the state. We were going to try to look at if there are opportunities lie elsewhere than that activity.
Or expansion. We did.
Yeah, and I think expansion, again, needs to be teased out between expansion of what activity, whether it was power supply, the footprint of the activity, footprint associated with things like district heating, because each one of those things has different potentially issues to be considered within it.
So I think that's good. So that actually gets to A. Again, I recognize the definition we're bringing to come back to, but I think for A, this gets at that second part of that bold language clause. And so here you can see kind of the language about prohibit the expansion of current and or construction of any new large scale industrial electric generation biomass facilities in the state. And there was a lot of conversation that the working group had about it. You can kind of see kind of what the details there are in relation to specifically the existing facilities. And the group tried to define expansion about in this way. And then there was a note that they're going to try to kind of finesse this question of the thermal question by saying improvements without expansion could include changes that result in increased efficiency with no increase in footprint, reductions in GHG emissions or other air pollutants or impacts to the community. So just Charlie or Judy, anything else on A, or just for clarity from the working group about what was intended for this section A here?
Yeah, I know there was lots of discussion and a lot of people were in favor of not improving in expanding, but there were some who were not. And so that's why it's recommended we have more information.
Yeah, and I think I'd say that one of the biggest discussion points around expansion that, in retrospect, I wish we had time to dig in more to understand better, was just around the McNeil plant to expand for district heating up to the hospital and UVM campus in those areas. So when we talk about expansion, that was one specific site-based question that we were wrestling with, which we didn't have time to dig into as much as I think we could have or should have or had the opportunity to.
Questions from the working group on A there, just for clarity. Again, we can discuss whether you agree with them or not, but I just want to make sure there's understanding first.
Patrick, was there somebody on this committee that was from air quality? I thought I remembered somebody introducing themselves.
Megan, I think Megan might. Megan, do you want to just describe, Megan, your role at DEC?
Well, one of the comments that came up was that McNeil was the largest polluter in this state. Does anybody have any data on that?
So Judy, we can provide some emissions reporting information from McNeil. They report to us annually what the scope of their emissions are in the state. And I can't speak to that relative to other sources, but I think it would depend on the pollutant that you're referring to. But we can provide that data.
And Megan,
That would be helpful because there's a lot of articles on the internet that talks about the flaws in their data and that they're not accurate. And of course, we didn't have the skills to figure that out.
Yeah, we use emission factors that are provided to us in a manual that EPA publishes and updates regularly based on the source that's emitting the contaminant. And Colin is also really familiar with that since he helps with the emissions tracking from those sources as well. So that's what we use. It's called AP 42. It's pretty widely used emissions factor guidebook. But we can provide a copy of that to the committee and then also provide the data on McNeil and Rygate if that would be helpful.
That would be helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Megan, do those pollutants or emissions include like emissions like carbon dioxide and other kinds of GHG?
I don't know if AP 42 speaks to, I mean, it might cover some of the greenhouse gases. Colin would probably be better to speak to that.
Peter, I see your comment in the chat about burning anything other than wood.
Sorry, do you hang on a second? Colin was going to go, then I'll go right over to you after that.
Okay, sorry.
No worries.
That's okay. I was just going to say, I'm not sure if AP 42 covers that, but that is not CO2 emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions are not something that they report to us. So we may be able to calculate that total based on kind of the, call it throughput data, kind of what they burn. But that's not something we will have probably done already for them outside of that kind of chart on the CO2 emissions from just wood combustion. But for Megan's right, for the other pollutants, we will have an estimate on what those are.
Judy, go ahead.
Thank you. Peter, I noticed your comment that burning anything other than wood is illegal. We knew that, but the problem is the sheriff or the police go to these rural areas and it's burnt when they get there. So there's nothing really they can do.
I would say that we have, we investigate those sorts of situations all the time. That's the sort of nature of environmental regulation. A lot of the time it's already gone by the time it's there, but we know how to look for the residue of things and to look for indications that things have been burned that they weren't supposed to. Do it all the time with illegal open burns and things of that nature. And so I think if anybody has concerns, they should contact our enforcement office. And
you mean like the sheriff when you call the sheriff?
No, the Department of Environmental Conservation and Environmental Enforcement office.
Oh, because like I think Charlie was the one that had this story about calling the sheriff about the Pampers, and of course when they got there they're all burned. And I got a call from a person who was ordering all the junk mail they could. They got one of those log rollers and they just rolled them into logs and threw the logs in for theirs.
So I would that is something. I don't even know where to begin there. But yeah, we
didn't either.
Our investigation team has the expertise to explore those types of issues in a way that a local sheriff isn't going to have that expertise. And so I would encourage you to reach out, and I can happily provide the contact information for our enforcement officers. in the chat.
Yeah, and I'll just say, Judy, too, that regardless of when the unit was installed, you know, whether or not it's a unit that's no longer on the market because it's not very clean burning, we do have like setback requirements and stack height requirements for all units, regardless of when they were installed. And so oftentimes our team can, you know, just measure distances and look at stack heights and say, you know, you're not operating legally. You know, we can't tell what you're burning because it's burnt, but, you know, we can see those factors and take action based on that as well.
Let me ask Charlie to speak a little bit to B and Judy, and then I probably have to go to public comment. But in some ways, the crux of the recommendations that flow after B were from a really good discussion the working group, the Ag and Ecosystem Working Group subcommittee had around what we know and not know about essentially fuel sources to biomass. So Charlie, do you want to speak a little bit to B, and then Judy add your thoughts as well? And then that may be where we need to stop for today. But this B was a kind of an important crux, I think.
Well, I think B and C both get at kind of the questions we were raising earlier around life cycle accounting. And they basically look at how do we utilize existing research, or I'd add, what research do we need to do to figure out this question of life cycle accounting. So as we make recommendations around something like, you know, pellet mills or different uses of biomass for fuel sources, we can essentially say with efficacy that, you know, we have had a net change of fill in the blank in advocating for that policy shift. The study that was referenced here is one that we talked about a little on the panel or the committee, but it's really only one of a lot of research out there that we didn't have time to dig into. So I would just say at a high level, B and C get at exactly the conversation we were having earlier in terms of, you know, if we advance a policy recommendation to do something, you know, the goal is to have a net reduction of GHG emissions. But what do we know, or what do we need to know to actually make that policy informed by science?
Well, and it was a little more than that too, because in order to be at net zero, the article was saying it had to be a certain amount of sawmill residue. And there was no way to confirm that people were making pellets or using pellets or purchasing pellets that used 50% residue. So the pellet burning, the article goes on to explain that using pellets that doesn't have 50% sawmill residue in them is not net zero. And so there was lots of controversy around that, and the discussion and lots of research that went into the language that is used by foresters and loggers about defective and low grade trees that they cut and what it actually means. I mean, any tree that stores carbon can't be that defective. It needs to be cut down. And so there was lots of discussion about that.
And so what I want to note is I think this is where I think the subcommittee really realized they were at the limits of their expertise. They needed more help. We didn't have time. And so I think one of the questions for this group is this, what partly this group is to do is to try to investigate these questions further. Do we want speakers to come in, et cetera, which we can't answer today, but we need to kind of, Jane, my take is we probably need to really start answering at the first of our next meeting, as well as finishing up going through the rest of these recommendations just for clarity. I'm aware of the time though, so I wonder if I'm going to stop sharing screen. I want to see if there's a chance for public.
Can I just add one thing, Pat?
Sure,
that's what I'd want to do. It's come up in the chat a few times and in discussion, and I don't think anybody on the committee was looking at this idea of net zero. Like if we take a tree and we put it up a smokestack, it's eventually going to just be net zero in the wash. I think the complexity here was getting into kind of what is the actual fluctuation in carbon stocks of biogenic carbon, and then as people have pointed out, there's all the associated things that come with it, right? If we're utilizing a fuel source from our forests here and replacing that, which was previously a fuel source which was shipped here from somewhere else, like oil or something like that, there's there's other complexities in here around kind of the flux in carbon. So I just want to say that I don't think anybody here is just saying that if we take our woods and throw them a smokestack, that we're going to be net zero. So just to
Well,
make sure
some
that's
people
clear
would.
there.
Yeah, there was discussion about that.
So, yeah.
And I think that again, these actions, we're trying to really have a much more nuanced view and still realizing also that there was a lot more to learn. Jane, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to flag, just for scheduling purposes, and maybe we'll do this after public comment, but I'd be interested in hearing from folks around frequency of meetings. And then I'd like to move to set up a regular meeting so we're not ad hoc trying to schedule this. So to have a standing biomass task group meeting, and then based on the conversation today, think about frequency of meetings. And as I'll just put out there, it feels like we're not really at the crux of what the work plan is for between now and some determined end date yet. I'll just remind folks that it was scheduled to go back to the council, the tabled actions for late spring, and there is a council meeting scheduled that will focus on both transportation and biomass in June. So we should, transportation's already decided that that's not enough time for them and that they'll provide a substantive update in June, but plan to have recommendations to put forward for the council to consider in the fall. But we haven't even gotten to sort of the point of being able to ask that question, like, is June enough time, or what is like the work plan for this group? So just putting that out there, that thinking about frequency of meetings and thinking about the proposed timeline for accomplishing the work would be really helpful.
That's good. Let me do a public comment and we'll try to wrap up quickly, Jane, to that point in our last 6 minutes. So if anybody wants to make a public comment, ask only if you could keep it short. Sorry about that. Thanks, Judy. And then we'll take public comment and we'll do a quick work plan close. So anybody wants to make a public comment, just raise your hand. Zach.
Hi, everybody. How are you? Good to see you. It's been a while. I'm Zach Porter. I'm the director of Standing Trees, and it's great to just check in with all of you. I appreciate you opening this conversation up to the public, and hope that in the intervening months that those of you who I haven't seen in the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee are doing well. I just wanted to briefly make a couple of suggestions or comments. I'm trusting that this group will seek additional outside input beyond the people who you've brought into this task group. And I wanted to, if that hasn't been mentioned already, although I think it has, I just wanted to put another star by that. Please bring in outside experts. We are lucky in New England to have some of the leading experts on biomass located here in our region. Rachel Smolker of Biofuel Watch is right here in Heinsberg, Vermont, and would be willing to speak with this group. Another person who we should absolutely invite is Mary Booth, who is with Policy for Public Integrity in Massachusetts, and a really amazing organization. She's a global expert on biomass as well. Bill Muma is a name I've mentioned going back to the beginning of the Climate Action Plan process. And I just want to register that I was disappointed during the Climate Action Plan process that we didn't have more of those kinds of outside expert voices come in to inform the conversation. And I realize that there's a lot going on in a limited amount of time, but we have time now. We've extended the conversation for biomass. So I hope that in kind of giving ourselves that extra time, we slow down, we bring in those expert voices, we really learn about the details here. And so please, use me, use others as references, as sources of ideas for who those individuals might be. On the topic of carbon neutrality, I just wanted to say, we heard really clearly from Colin today that biomass was treated as carbon neutral in the assessment of carbon fluxes in Vermont. And so, that was maybe the clearest statement that I've heard since the beginning of this process, that's how we've been looking at biomass. So until we kind of address this fundamental issue, it seems challenging to move forward. So again, that's another, I guess, reason for bringing in some of those outside experts. I think I'll just leave it there. Thank you again, and look forward to following this conversation.
Thanks, Zach. Okay, any other public comment before I do a little bit of planning, speaking of which? So, and Jane, so I think, and it's actually partly even to Zach's point, I think we need some time to discuss, again, how we're going to tackle the kind of the tabled actions and what expertise we do want to bring in some fashion, and how we're going to do that over the period of time we are. So Jane, I maybe we can just turn this group quickly. Where are people, in terms of the work we need to get done and what you can tolerate in terms of meetings? Those are two things, not necessarily together. What is the group's sense of how often you want to meet? It could be weekly, it could be every other week, it could be monthly. I don't, what are, Jane, maybe one thing is, how often is transportation meeting?
Officially, well, that's a hard thing to say, actually. I would say weekly.
What do you all think about meeting frequency? Liz, what are your thoughts?
Boy, not weekly, I don't think, at least given, I mean, what it feels like we're hearing is that there's a number of streams of work underway and things to hear about and people to hear from. But I'm not clear yet on how weekly meetings of this particular group would advance getting that work done. So yeah, I'm only one person, but weekly feels too frequent to be productive for this group. But, and I hate to say, I'm going to say one more thing. Until we actually understand better the scope, it may be hard to actually answer that question, Patrick. So in other words, if there was something more specific for us to be doing, it might very much feel like weekly would be appropriate, but that doesn't feel true right now.
No, that's helpful. TJ, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to learn here. I've been quiet just listening today and realizing that from where the groups have come from. But I think it would be hard, just personally, I think it would be hard to commit to the focus and attention to a weekly meeting, honestly, if I'm being honest. But I also think that there's a less frequent meeting of this group would allow time for some work to happen in between, potentially, because we know it's not all, not everything happens at the meeting. And so I think bi-weekly seems the most frequent that we could do, and I'm not even sure if that's possible. So depending on the work plan.
What about, I'm going to take up TJ and Liz's point, is that one of the, I think we may have to change this to Liz's point about we don't quite know yet, because we don't know quite what our scope is, but I wonder whether we could go ahead and try to start scheduling a meeting every other week. Jane, tell me what you think about this, for 2 hours, and we'll get those in the books for, I don't know, a month or 6 weeks. And then I think it sounds like then our maybe Jane and my job is to work with you all in between and bring to you next time the beginnings of a work plan or something that will give you a better sense of what, how we start diving into this and what we might need. I think part of that is this question of who you want to invite for expertise, and that can be a discussion we can have next time. But how does that sound to go ahead and get things scheduled for every other week? And we recognize we need to bring a credible and hash through with you a work plan to make sure that then makes sense going forward. Is that okay for now? Schedule some things and then really make sure we're building a work plan starting next meeting in detail. Thumbs up, thumbs middle, thumbs down. What do you think? Billy, what do you think?
Sorry, my computer cut out for a second, so I missed on this. I think that's reasonable, but just to reiterate, we need to have a clear scope, a clear work plan, clear agendas that we stick to. This is a complicated topic that can chew up a lot of time. So we really, from my perspective, really need to manage our time so that we get to a decision point, whatever that decision is, without exhausting our capacity.
Peter?
I guess I would echo that point and maybe speak to Charlie's point earlier about we need to understand what inputs we need to be able to make decisions. And seem to be trying to make decisions without those inputs. And so it becomes a constant churn that just meeting more is not actually going to solve. And so I think I would like some specificity around what questions the members of the working group would like to answer and how we might go about doing that so that we can see whether it's worthwhile to continue to meet biweekly. Because if we aren't able to make progress, then we're just going to burn ourselves out before we have any of the data in hand. And I think that would be the worst possible outcome.
And I think since I think last meeting, we got to the point that the tabled actions are our focus, but there's a whole set of questions within those tabled actions, right? That we need to, Peter, I think to your point, we need to then wrestle with. So Jane, I'm not sure what else to suggest other than you and I maybe need to put our heads together, draft something up, let you all respond to it via email, and then we can bring something in to discuss as a full group next time. But Jane, what do you think?
Yeah, I like that. And I would appreciate some offline conversations just with folks to really get pulse of everything that we've been talking about in order to help frame that for us to vet in a meeting.
Right. And I think, just to say quickly, in tabled actions, there's a whole set of issues in the tabled actions around existing plants. That's a chunk of work. What the questions are, what we can do with it, I don't know. There's the question Charlie noted about kind of life cycle costing, and that's complex and would require some expertise to be brought in and people to talk about. And then there are some specific things specifically around wood pellets, which are partly related back to the life cycle costing question. So there's at least 3 chunks of topics within the tabled actions we would have to address in some fashion. Okay, well, with that, we're a bit over. So we will confer with you, and Jane, I will owe you all a draft work plan to really focus in on. We'll do some scheduling in the meantime. And I think what I'm hearing from the group is that we need to make sure that we are focused and we are making progress so we don't spin our wheels and exhaust people. So I think important point noted. Any other comments from the work group before we close today? And thanks for in fact, let me save chat before we go. And thanks to those folks who are suggesting potential folks to hear from. That's great.
I just had one quick question, and I wish I had asked Judy this before, and I might have missed it at the beginning, but the slides that were shared around McNeil, do we know where those came from? There's no attributation. Is that the right word? there's no source behind it. I'm just curious.
Judy sent them to us this morning, so I would have to confirm that those are in fact Judy's directly. I don't know 100%. That's where we're.
Okay.
I'll do that and make sure I cite that so it's right there on the link on the website.
That'd be great just to know where they came from. I mean, the pictures look like McNeil. I'm just curious. Thanks.
Great. All right. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it. See you in a few weeks. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.